Hello everyone, this is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. Welcome back for episode 5 of Researching Your Civil War Ancestor. And today's episode we're going to talk about finding sources on your ancestor's Confederate unit. And in the previous episodes you've learned about how you can research your ancestor's Civil War service or try and find out more about what they did during the war. Now, you can find out a lot of really interesting information about your relative's service, but for the most part, it's not going to tell you some of the more basic questions about what life was like for your soldier. It's not going to tell you what it was like to go into battle for the first time, or what kinds of food the soldiers ate, or what it was like to sleep out under all kinds of weather in all kinds of conditions. And today I'm going to try and help you answer some of those questions. And to begin with, I'm just going to give you a little background on what it was like to be a Mississippi Confederate soldier during the war. And Mississippi soldiers only spent a very small amount of their time actually in combat. For every day they spent in combat, they probably spent weeks or even months training and in the camps or on the march. Combat took up just a very small part of their time. So their days were generally filled with a lot of just, what they considered a boring daily routine, filled with plenty of just good old-fashioned hard work. And fortunately, that was something that these Mississippians were used to. By and large, most of them were farmers. They were used to a farmer's life. They were used to hard work. So life in the camps in that respect was not anything different than what they had grown up with. But for the Mississippians who joined up in 1861, also much of the day was spent learning to drill, learning the complex military maneuvers that their lives would later depend on once they did go into combat. They would practice until they could move and fire quickly without hesitation and in response to orders. Adjutant James R. Benford of the 15th Mississippi Infantry described what it was like to have to try and teach new recruits how to drill. And he said, quote, "We remained in camp about 6 weeks, drilling twice each day. The officers and men, all being raw recruits, discipline was very galling to them, and as they would be brought under rigid military discipline, a large amount of first-class swearing could be heard every day." And yet, these were men that were used to being, their own bosses. They were farmers, and Southerners were kind of a proud people to begin with, and they did not take to military discipline easily. So those first days and weeks in camp, learning to obey the orders of superior officers, came hard to a lot of soldiers. But eventually, they did learn the necessity for it, and they became first-rate soldiers. And then when they weren't drilling, trying to learn all these complex military formations and all the different manual of arms and all of that material, they spent time doing such unglamorous jobs as digging latrines, cutting wood, toting water, policing up the camp, picking up a garbage, you name it. They would do it. And this is illustration here is a good example of a camp scene. There's not a lot of Confederate camp scenes from the war, and fortunately we do have some for Mississippians. And this is a picture of the Port Gibson riflemen taken in camp in 1861. This was when they were down in Florida. And images like this are not very common, but there are a few of them for some of the Mississippians, particularly those that went down to Pensacola, Florida in 1861. Now, when it comes to food, early in the war, soldiers in camp tended to eat pretty well. In fact, some of them might say that it was some of the best food they had ever had, because a lot of these guys came from pretty, poor backgrounds. To give you an example, in a letter written on May 18, 1862, Sergeant James W. Thornhill of the 38th Mississippi Infantry wrote home to his family, and he gave a very good description of what kind of food he was being issued. And he told his family, "We are getting along very well here so far. We have had plenty to eat. We get cornmeal and flour and sugar and coffee and molasses and peas and pork, and some gets beef. We get vinegar and soap and salt. I think we are faring very well, although some complain mightily. And you're always going to have those people in any organization, the ones that are going to complain no matter what the conditions are. That's just a fact of life. But when it came to actually preparing their food, the men were generally left up to their own devices to prepare it however they saw fit. And most soldiers, for convenience, ended up banding together into small groups, which they would call a mess. And these men would pool their food together, pool all of their implements. They would cook together and eat together. And this is a good photograph from early in the war, just a good example of a Civil War mess. It's a group of friends that have joined together to have their communal meal. And these groups tended to form very tight bonds over the course of the war. So when you lost a member of your mess to combat or to disease, the loss was felt very strongly by the group. And while they ate pretty well in the early days of the war, as the conflict dragged on and shortages became very common in the South, it would often become difficult to supply Confederate soldiers in the field. And a lot of times they would have to make do on reduced rations. Beef and vegetables were often very hard to obtain, and it was not uncommon for the soldiers to survive for weeks at a time on a diet of salt pork, beans, cornbread, hardtack, and I'm sure after a while this really did a number on your digestive system. But the soldiers would supplement this as best they could by buying extra food from locals, or sometimes scavenging and or going out at night and stealing from the nearby farmers. That was kind of endemic around any Civil War camp. You would have a lot of that going on, no matter how much the officers might try and put a stop to it. Because hungry soldiers, one way or another, they're going to get some food. Now, observers commented on how thin Confederate soldiers looked, but the fighting or the lack of food did nothing to diminish their fighting spirit. During the Antietam campaign in 1862, a civilian in Frederick, Maryland, described the Confederates that marched through, saying that they were, quote, "the dirtiest men I ever saw. They're a most ragged, lean, and hungry set of wolves. Yet there was a dash about them that the Northern men lacked." And in fact, this photograph is a very rare instance of actually showing Confederate troops in the field on a march. They had stopped while on the march in Frederick, Maryland, and a local photographer took this image. And it's one of my favorites of the war, because it's just a slice of life. These troops had stopped for a few minutes on the march. Within a few more minutes, they were probably going to be back on the road and headed toward a battle. But to make up, for their lack of rations, soldiers would, of course, steal. And there's a funny story about the 11th Mississippi in this regard. They were brigaded early in the war with the 4th Alabama, the 6th North Carolina, and the 2nd Mississippi Infantry under General Whiting. And Colonel Pender, the commander of the 6th North Carolina, reported to headquarters that a hog had been killed within the lines of the 11th Mississippi Infantry. And General Whiting, who was a Mississippian himself, inquired what evidence that the colonel had of this. And Colonel Pender stated that he had heard the report of a gun inside the lines and heard the hog squeal. And Whiting replied, "I am satisfied you are mistaken, Colonel. When an 11th Mississippian shoots a hog, it don't squeal." And so these guys, they were well-known foragers, and they had quite a reputation that they lived up to. Now, one of the big problems that Mississippi soldiers faced when they were preparing their food was that they often lacked the proper utensils just to cook it properly. This was especially true when they were on the march in a campaign, because they just couldn't carry a lot of really heavy equipment like frying pans and a lot of implements with them. Sergeant George P. Clark of the 36th Mississippi Infantry described how he cooked a meal while he was campaigning once. And he said, "We found on arrival that orders had been issued to prepare 3 days' rations, which we took nearly all night owing to the lack of cooking utensils. I remember that I had to bake my bread that night on an old broke fire shovel, hoe cake fashion. Soldiers were often reduced to wonderful straits in this respect, for the provisions were often dished out to us when we had nothing to cook it in, and we could hunt up something, we could cook it in ashes, or we could devour it raw just as we saw proper." And in this picture here are some good examples of just the field expedients that soldiers would have used in cooking. Like you've got half of a canteen here that's had a crude handle put onto it, so you can use it as a frying pan. You've got a soldier's plate and cups. You've got what looks like a makeshift corn sifter that looks like it was made out of either a plate or possibly half of a canteen. You've got one of the things the soldiers couldn't do without a coffee pot. Soldiers loved their coffee. And anytime soldiers stopped on a march for any amount of time, the first thing they would be doing is starting a fire and getting some coffee going. And it was very common when the soldiers were in camp, if there were any Federals nearby, they would make their way to a meeting place, and Confederate soldiers would swap tobacco, which they usually had in abundance, for Union coffee. So coffee was just one of those indispensable items that soldiers really looked forward to and couldn't do without. Now, soldiers also had to fight a never-ending battle against boredom while they were in camp. One of the best ways of fighting boredom was for the soldiers to get letters or packages from home. Soldiers wrote home whenever they had the opportunity. Those that were illiterate, that couldn't write themselves, would often get a tent mate who was literate to write for them. And letters and packages from home really helped keep up the morale of the soldiers. Private Joseph W. Pendleton of the 38th Mississippi Infantry, in one of his letters to a sister, said, "Sister, you don't know how much help to my mind if I had some interesting books to read. I am so lonesome here. My little testament is a good friend to me. I would write oftener if I had the paper. It cannot be gotten easily." Now, in the letters that were sent to the soldiers in camp, one of the common themes that you see from parents and siblings back home was warnings about the evils of life in camp. And there was good reason for this. Within a Civil War camp, you had just about every vice known to man. And for many a young recruit, these vices were almost irresistible. Gambling, drinking, profanity, they were all very common. And soldiers received constant reminders from home to try and stay on the straight and narrow. And J.A. Gillespie, whose brother William Allen was a private in the 38th Mississippi Infantry, wrote once to him and warned him, saying, "O William, let me entreat you to beware the sins of the camp. Do not be tempted to join in them. Remember you have an angel wife in heaven, and your heart's desire is to go to her. Be a true Christian, and perhaps you may influence others to do right." And regardless of these warnings, and no matter how heartfelt they were, a lot of soldiers just could not give up on drinking, couldn't give up on gambling. Card playing was extremely popular, but soldiers were known to bet on just about anything. Even they would get lice and race lice. If there was something to bet on, soldiers would find it. And one Mississippian, G.W. Roberts, was so upset by the card playing in his tent that was being carried on by his tent mates that he wrote home and complained about it. He said to his parents, "I have asked them to quit playing cards in our tent or about our tent. It does not become any man to intrude upon me like they do. If they wish to play cards, let them build a house off to themselves, then they could play to their own satisfaction." And just as prevalent as gambling was drinking. Mississippians in the 19th century drank a lot of liquor, and soldiers were certainly no exception. And although alcohol was generally forbidden inside of a camp, thirsty soldiers found a way to sneak it in. In fact, some enterprising members of a Mississippi company smuggled a half-gallon of liquor into camp in a hollowed-out watermelon, and then dug it a hole into the floor of their tent and hid it there. And they would tap the watermelon with a straw, and when one of the tent mates wanted to have a drink, he would lay flat on the floor and then suck the alcohol through a straw. And his comrades would stand by and watch his Adam's apple, and they would cut him off after 2 gulps. But the presence of alcohol in the camps was counterbalanced by religion, and there were a number of very sincere and heartfelt religious revivals in the Confederate camps during the course of the war. Most of the regiments had chaplains. Most of them were Protestant, although there were a few units that had a large number of Catholics that did have Catholic chaplains. Now, another way that the soldiers tried to combat boredom was through recreation, and one of their favorite pastimes was music. The men took comfort in the popular songs of the day. They often sang informally at night around the campfire. There were many tunes sung by the soldiers. Some of the more popular were Dixie, the Bonnie Blue Flag, Lorena, Maryland, My Maryland, and then all kinds of instrumental music were also very important to the soldiers. James J. Kirkpatrick of the 16th Mississippi Infantry wrote on October 30th, 1863, and said this about his regimental band. He said, "Camp 2 miles south of the Rappahannock, drilling as usual. Went over to the band in the evening to hear some vocal and instrumental music. Our band is a great institution. It always keeps its numbers undiminished and labors with the greatest assiduity at tooting. Their music, however, is never the sweetest nor the most harmonious." So some of these regimental bands may not have been very good, but the men still appreciated the effort that they put into helping to lighten the mood and fight the boredom. Now, most campaigning during the Civil War took place during the spring and summer. Once it became winter, they tended to go into camp, just simply because the roads simply became impassable for large numbers of men for the most part. And that's why most Civil War commanders tried to avoid combat operations during the winter if they all could. And once winter weather set in, the men would try and establish a good shelter that was going to last them through a long, cold winter. And this usually occurred in November or December. When the Mississippians went into winter quarters, very often they would build a cabin, much like the one you see in this picture here. These men were pretty handy with their hands. A lot of them had built their own cabins when they started farming in Mississippi. And so a lot of them had firsthand experience on how you build a log cabin. David Holt of the 16th Mississippi Infantry described in his memoir how he and his comrades built a shelter for the winter. And he said, "The days began to get cold and the weather showed signs of snow. We set about building our first bunks for winter quarters. It takes 2 to build a bunk, so Cousin Jim and I worked together. First we dug a hole in the ground. It measured 6 by 8 feet and 2.5 feet deep. We then cut logs and fashioned a crib about 5 feet in height, which gave us a room about 7 feet high. Chinking the logs, we used dirt to plaster up the cracks. The fireplace was cut in one end of the pit and a stick chimney built over it. Next came the roof, the hardest job of all." And one of the hardest things soldiers had to do was when winter camp was breaking up and they were about to start actively campaigning, they had to walk away from those nice, snug, warm cabins and start living under tents or even just under a blanket again. And they would also have to leave all kinds of stuff they had acquired over the winter behind that they just couldn't carry with them on the march. And it was really during these periods of active campaigning when the men suffered most, because just the basic necessities of food, water, and a little bit of clothing took up most of their available storage space, because you can't carry a lot with you when you're marching everywhere you're going. Uh, they probably had about 40 to 50 pounds of equipment all told, and even that over time is really going to wear you down when you do some prolonged marching. But the Mississippians very quickly learned how to survive even under the very harshest of conditions. Sometimes in the mud, in the freezing rain. In fact, David Holt of the 16th Mississippi wrote about how he and his comrades survived one particularly cold night when they were just camping on the ground. And he said, at last, late at night, we filed into the right into a heavy forest. We were dead tired. We made a fire the first thing. Wood was plentiful, and we made a fire at least 20 feet long beside a large log, and then thawed out on the smoky side until we were smoked out. Then we wiped our eyes and breathed on the wind side until frozen out. Cousin Jim had worked extra hard trying to keep his feet. He said that he just had to lie down. He spread down a pair of linen tent flies, and we lay down on them and covered with both blankets. We tied our handkerchiefs over our hats and under our chins and kept on all our clothes. Sleep came instantly. We slept as long as the heat lasted, and then got cold and awakened to find the top blanket, my blanket, frozen to the ground and covered with sleet. And it just goes to show you, how hardy these guys were to survive under, very difficult conditions with just a very minimum of equipment to protect them. Now, unfortunately for sick or wounded soldiers, the Civil War came decades before the understanding of a lot of the modern germ theory, and also a lot of the medical advances that would save the lives of troops in future conflicts. Most Civil War wounds were caused by small arms, and the small soft lead mini balls like this one right here. This is a 3-ring 58 caliber U.S. mini ball. These did terrible wounds, particularly if it hit a long bone. It did a terrible amount of splitting and smashing damage because these little bullets would just mushroom out. And very often the only choice the surgeon had was a quick amputation to try and save the soldier's life. One example of this is Lieutenant Colonel William L. Brandon of the 21st Mississippi Infantry. He had been wounded in the leg at the Battle of Malvern Hill in July 1862, and he had to have his leg amputated. And he later wrote of the operation, quote, "On examining the wound, he said there was no doubt of the propriety of an immediate amputation. I asked if he had any chloroform, and he said yes and proceeded. When I felt the tourniquet tighten on my leg, I called to him and said I was not under the influence of chloroform. He said he had no more and asked if he should proceed. I replied, off with it, and I supposed I could stand it. The operation was performed in an inconceivable short time, but the pain was horrible, particularly the tying up of the arteries, and I can only imagine what that must have felt like. Fortunately, in the case of most operations, chloroform was used, and the patients were thankfully unconscious, but I can only imagine what that pain must have felt like. And Brandon was not a young man. At the time the war started, he was 60 years old. And it's amazing, but he survived that amputation. He was never able to return to his unit, but he survived it. In fact, lived another 20 years after that amputation. So if secondary infection didn't set in, soldiers that went through an amputation generally had a pretty good chance of surviving. It depended a lot on where you were wounded, but the doctors were very good at performing amputations. They could do them extremely quickly, but again, the big killer was secondary infection, because they just didn't know anything about modern germ theory, and they didn't really take any steps to try and sanitize their instruments, and that caused a lot of problems with infection. Now, if a wounded soldier survived his time in a field hospital near the front, he would eventually be moved to one of the general hospitals located throughout the Confederacy. There were a number of these hospitals in Mississippi. Some of the larger ones were Way Hospital at Meridian, Lauderdale Springs Hospital in Lauderdale County, and then Sims Hospital at Canton, Mississippi. There were also a lot of smaller temporary hospitals set up around the state that helped take care of the flood of wounded that streamed in after a major battle, such as the hospital that was set up on the campus of the University of Mississippi after the Battle of Shiloh to help take care of wounded from that battle. And this is just an illustration of a Civil War hospital with a soldier being cared for by some nurses. Now, during the course of the war, many Mississippians were captured and spent time in Union prisoner of war camps. Life in these camps was often very difficult. The men confined in them had to face exposure to an unfamiliar climate, often a very cold climate during the winter, because a lot of these camps were in the far northern states. They also had to combat disease from being crowded into such living conditions, as you see in this photo here. This is a photo of Camp Douglas near Chicago. And for the first 2 years of the war, captured men generally spent only a short time in a POW camp because they would be swapped for an equal number of Union soldiers. But in 1863, the parole system broke down, and it was after this that the camps really started to swell with thousands of prisoners. And Confederates were sent to a lot of hastily constructed POW camps up north. And living conditions really varied a lot from camp to camp. Benjamin H. Bounds of the 4th Mississippi Infantry was confined at Fort Delaware prison camp, and he wrote about the conditions there. He said, "The hardships and privations cannot be described. Our bedding consisted of one blanket and one suit of clothes to the man, spread on a bare floor with the thermometer ranging from 103 above to 28 degrees below zero. We had one stove to every 500 men and one bushel of coal per day in the winter months. The cold was so severe that men would cry like children." And I know these guys must have been so glad to get out of those camps at the end of the war. And unfortunately, a lot of them did. Death rates could be fairly high in some of these camps, not from any intentional ill treatment, just generally from being, the not getting enough good quality food, and also just the exposure to the elements, and also just being in close contact with so many men is going to lead to a lot of disease. So most of these camps had very large cemeteries attached where Confederate dead were buried. And unfortunately, the same was true for Union prisoners of war held in southern camps. Of course, the most notorious of which was Andersonville, Georgia, which had a very high death rate. But Mississippians distinguished themselves on battlefields throughout the South, in every theater of the conflict. Most of their deeds of valor were never recognized at the time, but a few individuals did receive official acknowledgement for their valor. In 1862, the Confederate Congress passed an act to authorize the award of medals and badges of distinction to soldiers as a reward, quote, "for courage and good conduct on the field of battle." The South never had the manufacturing capacity to make medals, but they did the next best thing, and they instead created a roll of valor. And the Confederate Adjutant Inspector General's office changed the award from a badge to having the soldier's name read at the head of his regiment at the first dress parade after its award, and having his name published in his local newspaper back home. And these men were chosen for the Roll of Honor by their fellow soldiers. Not every unit did it. Some didn't want to pick out individuals, thinking that everybody had been brave. But for those that did, after every major battle, all the soldiers would vote, and they'd pick a few, 2 or 3 soldiers out of the regiment that showed, conspicuous gallantry, and their names would be put on the Roll of Honor. And during the course of the war, 2,053 men were posted to the Confederate Roll of Honor. And of that number, 373 were awarded to Mississippians. This was the highest number awarded to any single southern state. Participation in the role was voluntary, so not every unit chose to do it, but one example of the kind of bravery that would get you on the roll of honor was that displayed by Mississippians during the Battle of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. During the fighting, so many men from the Magnolia State fell trying to take a strong federal position in a small skirt of woods that to this day the area is known as Hell's Half Acre. And it's just amazing that some of the losses these regiments took and still managed to stay an effective fighting force. Now, to take men into this kind of combat, it took a special kind of officer, because in this day and age, officers were usually called upon by force of circumstance to inspire their men by conspicuously leading from the front. And this came with a great risk, because it was very common for officers to be shot down in the course of a battle. An example of the kind of bravery it took to be an officer during the Civil War is found in an after-action report of General James R. Chalmers at the Battle of Fort Pillow, Tennessee. And he wrote in his after-action report, "I cannot speak too highly of the conduct of the troops under my command. Lieutenant Colonel Reed, temporarily commanding the 5th Mississippi Cavalry, was preeminently daring and fell mortally wounded while standing in the rifle pits and encouraging his men to charge, and Lieutenant Burton was killed at his side." And sometimes this kind of courage by not only the officers but the enlisted men could trigger almost a suicidal bravery if they lost a family member. Major Robert Stiles of the Richmond Howitzers witnessed firsthand this in action when Judson Smith of the 21st Mississippi Infantry lost his brother, who was killed at the Battle of Savage Station, Virginia. Stiles wrote that Judson was, quote, altogether deranged by the death of his brother, and when the 21st Mississippi assaulted the Union lines at Malvern Hill a few days later, it was said, "The regiment on its first charge stopped ascending that fearful slope of death and turned back. Judge Smith did not stop. He went right on, never returned, and was never seen or heard from again." Now, to make this story even more tragic, if that's possible, when the father heard about the loss of his only 2 sons, he joined the Confederate Army and at the Battle of Iuka, Mississippi, made a suicidal charge just like his son and was never seen again. So you had an entire family there wiped out. And this picture here is of Cornet Posey, who was a brigadier general. He commanded a brigade of Mississippians in the Army of Northern Virginia. And he was a native Mississippian, attended law school at the University of Virginia, and he died in Charlottesville, Virginia, after being wounded in the leg at the Battle of Bristow Station on October 14, 1863. Initially, it was thought that his wound was just a minor one, but unfortunately, infection set in, and he ended up losing his life. Now, in this overview about the life of Mississippi soldiers, I've used many primary sources to let the soldiers speak for themselves as to what the war was like for them. Now, you can do the same thing and gain a better understanding of what your ancestors went through during the conflict by reading their letters, their diaries, their reminiscences of the men that served in the same unit as your relative. And a good place to start about finding information on your relative's unit is this book on the left, Military History of Mississippi, 1803 to 1898. This book was written by Dunbar Rowland, who was the first director of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, serving from 1902 to 1937. When the Mississippi Department of Archives and History was established in 1902, one of its initial missions was to document Mississippi's participation in the Civil War, and toward that end, he collected all sorts of reminiscences and letters and documents relating to the war. And so there's quite a lot of information about Civil War units at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and I highly recommend that you take advantage of their resources. It's open to all Mississippians and to all people throughout the country, and it would be well worth your while to take a look at and see what they have available. They do have an online catalog that you can search, and might give you a good idea of what they have available that could be useful to you. Now, another thing you should immediately do, check to see if the regiment your relative served in has a modern regimental history. There's lots of them out there, like the history of the 7th Mississippi Infantry, Going to Meet the Yankees, the history of the 6th Mississippi Infantry. That's a unit my relative served in. Or you might even be lucky enough to have a relative in the 38th Mississippi Infantry, and then you can find my book, Beneath Torn and Tattered Flags, a history of the 38th Mississippi Infantry CSA. But there's more of these books being published all the time, so it's definitely worth your while to do a little internet searching and seeing if there is a modern regimental history on your unit. And then, if you're really wanting to dive deep into the records, you've got to go to the official records of the War of the Rebellion. This series of 128 books covers the entire war, and it's all the official reports. Compiling this information began in 1864, before the war even ended, and then the official records were published between 1881 and 1901, and it would consist of 138,579 pages and 1,006 maps and diagrams. The official records consists of 4 series. The first series consists of reports of military operations made by Union and Confederate armies and navies by the commanders involved. Series 2 consists of records regarding prisoners of war. Series 3 and 4 deal with Union and Confederate military records that are not covered in the first 2 series. Now, back when I started doing research, you had to hunt up a series of these 128 books, and usually you had to go to a major library to find them, because not too many people are going to have a 128 volume set in their personal collection. Although I did know a few. You had a few hardcore researchers that had their own sets. But fortunately, through the miracle of modern technology, you can now find the entire series online. You can also buy it on a CD-ROM disc or a thumb drive. It's readily available, and it's very cheap. You can purchase it for less than $20. So I highly recommend that you and it's searchable. So you can search for wherever your particular relative's unit is mentioned. So you can find after action reports for the battles they were in, lists of casualties, reports by their senior officers. It's just an invaluable source, and I highly recommend that you check it out. Now, one last source that I will recommend that you look for if you're researching your relative's unit, and that is the historical memoranda that each unit had as part of their muster rolls. This information will be found on the microfilm, or if you're using a digitized set, it'll usually be listed as well with the unit. But the amount of information in these historical memoranda varies from unit to unit. Some of them, like the one shown here for the 21st Mississippi, is very detailed. For other units, they might be very basic, not more than a couple of sentences. So you never know until you check. But I highly recommend looking into it, because if there is a surviving historical memoranda for the regiment, it's going to be very useful. And I've used the one for the 21st Mississippi and the 38th Mississippi when I've been researching my regimental histories, and they come in quite handy, because sometimes they give you a level of detail you're not going to find in other sources. But this brings this episode to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. It really helps me to gauge how big of an audience I'm reaching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, please leave comments for me. I'd love to see them, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. But thank you again for watching.